Dear friends, it is a pleasure to be with you tonight, even though it is a virtual presence and not a real presence. And I would like to, first of all, extend my apologies as well as my thanks. My apologies that I couldn't be personally with you this evening and that we had to do this video talk instead. And guess what? I'm sitting in the office of the General Secretary of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales and talking to you, sharing with you some of my thoughts on Israel, Palestine. So in a sense, it comes from one of the highest echelons of the Catholic Church in this country. A word of thanks also for having invited me to share with you those thoughts, and words of thanks to Father Colin, to Patricia, and to all those who labored in order to make this meeting of yours possible and my input in it possible too. Now, what I'm going to try and do in those 15-20 minutes this evening is to talk to you about a concept of mine that has been with me for at least the last 2 decades. I'll title it as The Two Peoples, Three Faiths of the Holy Land, and then I'm going to add something to it. The Two Peoples and Three Faiths is a sentence, a phrase that I learned from my mentor, the former Latin Rite Catholic Patriarch of Jerusalem, Michel Sabah. He always used to refer to the peoples of the Holy Land as the two peoples and three faiths: Israelis and Palestinians, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And as my mentor during the time I was in Jerusalem, either running the Middle East Council of Churches or convening the Jerusalem Interchurch Committee meetings, or for that matter, perhaps equally importantly from a political perspective, participating in the second track negotiations during the Oslo chapter, he always used to basically refer to this phrase when we spoke about the situation and the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. So while I talk to you this evening, I'm going to add a dimension to this phrase of his. I'm going to say two peoples, three faiths, one space. In the sense that the space is a small space we're talking about, hence perhaps some of the problems that we are encountering in trying to resolve this conflict. It doesn't mean that it's a space that has to be shared in the political and institutional senses, but it is one that has to be understood in the context of the Holy Land, indivisible as it is. And as some of you, I'm sure, realize, when I said second track negotiator during the Oslo chapter, we are also at the moment remembering this year, in fact this month, the 20th anniversary of the Oslo Accords. As you might recall, there were two Oslo Accords. The first one was the broad principles, and the second one was the one that basically put some meat on the bones. And of course, I was fortunate enough, unfortunate enough, you decide how you want to interpret it. I was part of that journey, of that process, both with its hopes and its disappointments. So when I look at those 20 years and when I look at what is happening over those decades with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and then when I look today at what I see in front of me and how I will project it to you, friends, what I would say is that the so-called Arab Spring, which has been going on for the last 2.5 years, which started in Tunisia, then moved over to Egypt, to Yemen, to Libya, now the horrors of Syria as we see it, have somehow overwhelmed the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So whilst for a while we had the certainty of knowing that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was the political hub of the whole MENA region, now it is only one of those hubs, and there are many other hubs, some of them, Syria for example, being more horrifying at the moment than even Israel and Palestine can be. So within that, what has happened is that whilst Israel-Palestine has been overshadowed by the other events and uprisings taking place across the whole MENA region, what is still quite interesting is that it's an ongoing process that informs us in three key points. The Arab Spring, the uprisings, how do they inform the Israeli-Palestinian process? The first point I would like to refer to you is the fact that it underlines the effectiveness of people power. Finally, after years and decades of top-down rule, of people being unable or unwilling to say anything, suddenly that barrier of fear has been breached, and we now have a genie who's gone out of the bottle, and therefore in a sense it's very difficult to lure the genie back into the bottle. People are speaking out more openly, people are expressing their opinions even at the expense of their own lives sometimes. So people power is very important. The second thing that it underlines and how it informs the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is in the context of supporting democracy. Suddenly, perhaps out of the blue, unexpectedly, mystifyingly, democracy has become a currency in the Arab world, including in Israel and Palestine. People are saying, we don't accept totalitarianism anymore, we don't accept oppression anymore, we certainly don't accept occupation anymore. So in a sense, democracy has become a popular currency that has drawn people out of their shells, particularly the young generation, particularly those with social media resources and tools, to say enough is enough, we need to speak out and express ourselves. And the third thing that I believe is important is that finally we are having a discussion, albeit a painful one at times, about how do we include Islam, or how does Islam include itself into the mainstream policy making of the region. How can we talk of Islam, of religion, whilst also at the same time talking about pragmatism, talking about compromise, and talking about excessive zealotry? Well, I think what has happened is very simple. We hear a lot, Syria is a good example, Libya is a good example, where we talk about all those radical Islamicized societies. Well, friends, you know, I know, that those are the exception, they are not the rule. The majority of people, and of course the region as a whole is overwhelmingly Muslim, the majority of the people in the region, be it in the MENA or in Israel, Palestine, are people who are not exclusive, who are not ideological, who are not zealot, but who actually just want to live as neighbors. Of course, things change. When I grew up 30 years ago, things were different. Today, the norms and the mores have changed. However, there is the ability we have now to understand Islam. We are talking about Islamism, we're talking about the different ideological offshoots, we're talking about the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, the Muslim Brotherhood is very close to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Why? Because Hamas is also an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. In fact, if you notice, when President Morsi was president for 1 year in Egypt, Hamas grew. And then now that he's not president anymore, Hamas has somehow shrunk inwardly again. So those are the three important points that I would leave with you in terms of how does the so-called Arab Spring inform the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now I'm going to move forward by sort of saying, okay, we have a conflict. We've had a conflict since 1948, since 1967, since 1973, since 1987. Those are all seminal dates within the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So what can we do? Why is it that every time we talk, whether it's a US Secretary of State 5 decades back, or whether it's an Israeli Prime Minister 2 decades back, or whether it's the actual incumbents in both sides, why do we say, oh, it is so difficult, we have to seek a solution or a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? Well, let me tell you my view. I don't think we need to seek a solution. I don't think there is a need for a solution, because we do not need to reinvent the wheel. The solution is there, friends. It is there for all of you who have been laboring tirelessly toward this kind of inclusive, side-by-side Israeli-Palestinian reality. Take the Oslo process, not the accords, because they're much maligned, but the process which distilled some thoughts, political thoughts from the Israeli and Palestinian sides on what lies ahead. Take the Clinton parameters of what he perceived would be the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Take the Arab Initiative, which in my opinion is the most potent and valid initiative, which basically says something very simple. Israel recognizes a viable, contiguous, independent, sovereign Palestinian state, and then all the Arab and Muslim countries of the Arab League would in one go recognize Israel. Can you imagine the breakthrough that we would have if that initiative were to be applied and implemented? Then we also have the Olmert discussions between President Mahmoud Abbas and Prime Minister Ehud Olmert at the time. And of course, we have the latest round of negotiations that are discreetly pottering along whilst nobody is aware of them, which is the good thing, because when we were doing Oslo at the beginning, when academics were dealing with it rather than politicians, it was done in the Scandinavian countries, it was done out of the limelight, hence why suddenly two viewpoints came together and led to a process which, unfortunately, as I said a couple of times already, fell down, was dispersed, did not work. But the parameters are there. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to say, oh my God, how am I going to solve this problem? The core issues are the same, the details are the same, the solutions are the same. What we need to do, for instance, now, and I've said this to the negotiating parties, is start by looking at the final borders, the boundaries. If you start to delineate the boundaries of the future state of Palestine, you're already achieving a huge amount, because you're also tackling the issue of those large numbers of settlements that are mushrooming in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. So when I say we don't need to reinvent the wheel, why then are we having a problem finding a solution to this conflict? The reason is that there isn't the political will. And the political will, call it goodwill, call it good faith, is not there, has not really been there, despite people like Yitzhak Rabin, despite people like Mahmoud Abbas. It hasn't really been there since those negotiations started. You see, what you need is the strong political leadership, in this case, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and President Mahmoud Abbas, to say, look, this is the parameter, the shape of what we are trying to achieve. We have to have the gumption, the political will, the ability to say, let's go for it and do it. But that's not even the answer. Because supposing, assuming, and it's a big big assumption, that they do manage to do it, what will happen then is they will have to sell it to their own constituencies. And if you look at the panoply of different opinions in both the Israeli and the Palestinian sides, you realize why it is so difficult. Israelis are divided. All the polls say, yes, Israelis support a peace process, a peace solution, two states, one next to the other, in security, in peace, viable, contiguous, sovereign. But when you tell them, what does that mean in reality, they're a bit stumped. They're a bit stumped because their leadership is not helping them fill in the dots. So they have to sell it to their own cynical constituencies. And if they do that, the framework, the political will, and the grassroots or popular support for it, then we are so much nearer to a solution. And I said so much nearer. I didn't say we concluded it, but so much nearer to a solution than we would be today. So in this large picture, political picture that I've tried to draw for you, and within which I have orbited in and out at various stages of my political life, both as a conflict resolution expert, as a political second-track negotiator, but also as an ecumenical church consultant working closely with all the churches in Jerusalem, I am hopeful that one day we are going to be able to find the Holy Grail. Now, what are the churches doing? We talk about justice and peace. You are justice and peace. So what are we doing in terms of the churches? I'll give you a little story about my involvement with this whole process. I'm a lawyer by training. I did my LLD, the equivalent of a PhD in international law, and I worked in the field for a while until I suddenly found myself with the Middle East Council of Churches, whose headquarters are in Lebanon. That to me was the first entry into a whole tapestry of churches that is entirely different from just saying, this is my church, this is my community, this is my bishop, and those are my priests. Especially in the Middle East, where you have roughly, well, there used to be 20% of the overall population, now they're only roughly 5% across the region, of Christians who are Orthodox. You've Greek Orthodox, you've got Armenian Orthodox. I underline Armenian, I am Armenian. You've got the Copts, you've got the Syrians, you've got the Catholics, you've got the Anglicans, the Lutherans. There are in fact what we call 13 traditional churches. And those heads of churches meet together, and they decided they wanted to headhunt me and bring me to Jerusalem to lead the negotiations during the Oslo chapter, and following that on an ecumenical level on behalf of all those churches together. Now those within you who are involved with church work know how difficult it is to work with one church. Multiply that by 13, would you not wonder that I have some white hair on my head? And I had to deal with those 13 churches, reconcile their views, distill them, ingest them in order to take them to the negotiating table. So I've been working within those, both in the political level, in the ecumenical level, and in interfaith dialogue with Judaism and with Islam. Christians are very important. Christians are reconcilers. That's what the Bible tells us. Christians are bridge builders. Christians are people who dedicate their life for peace and justice. And in that sense, that is what all those churches, irrespective of the whole defaced picture that is sometimes drawn of those churches, this is what they do, this is what their ministry is all about. And in a sense, what I would say, that you have the church with its prayerful reality, you have the church with its political reality, you have the church with its media reality, you have the church with its humanitarian reality, and you have the church as ambassadors of the region. When a Catholic or an Orthodox or an Anglican speaks in Jerusalem, in Bethlehem, in Nazareth, in any part of the Holy Land, it resounds, it echoes across this wide fellowship of ours, and therefore it has much more weight than the numerical value we attach to it. So in a sense, if I want to wrap this up, What I would say is the following. The Holy Land is not an impossible task. It can be resolved. Yes, many people are going to nod and say, Harry is in La La Land. Harry is not in La La Land. Harry knows the practical difficulties, the obstacles, some of which still remain insuperable. But Harry is also convinced that with the right political will and the good faith, it is possible to conclude a deal. It is possible to sell that deal to the peoples, the two peoples and three faiths of the Holy Land. And it is possible to find a way to inhabit this one space where much of the Bible story took place, to inhabit it as two proud people whose narratives do not need to clash. They can live side by side together. So let me thank you once again, each and every one of you, for having given me this time to express some of my thoughts. Let me thank you for having accepted this video talk rather than see me in the flesh standing in front of you and enjoying your hospitality. And let me also, if I may, thank James Abbott for having taken the time of doing this video on your behalf and on my behalf. He's somebody I work with very closely here with our podcasts. Go onto the website of the Catholic Church in England and Wales. You will find a list longer than my two arms put together of podcasts we have done of Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Iraq, you name it, it's there. Go on my website, epictasis.net. Go on the Huffington Post blog that I do. Go on Ecclesia, the think tank website that I write in. You will get more views. You will get more details of where I think. But at the end of the day, I come back to the very simple statement. We believe in Jesus Christ as our Savior. We believe in the Beatitudes. That to me is the message I want you to carry with you. Go and read the Sermon on the Mount. You probably know it better than I do. Each and every one of them is a manifesto for our lives. And as you apply those, think of the two peoples, Israelis, Palestinians, three faiths, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, one space. Friends, it can happen. Thank you.